the fossil record would show transitional species, like the long sought-after missing link, a creature that would be something more than an ape, but less than a human. Darwin knew his thoughts about evolution would stand or fall on whether or not these in-between links existed. In fact, it was Darwin himself who warned, unless transitional forms could be found in the fossil record, the theory of evolution is worthless speculation. In other words, if evolution was ever going to be proven to be true, it would first have to find fossils that showed these in-between links between various species actually existed. He speculated that when these intermediate fossils were found, they would clearly show the steps from one species to the next. That means there would be fossil records of very strange-looking creatures. Fish with beginnings of legs, reptiles with primitive wings, and ape-like creatures with human characteristics.
Because my favorite is a platypus. And the reason the platypus is my favorite is because it was discovered in 1797 and sent back to the British Museum, and the British scientists actually thought that some taxidermist had cut up all these different animals and stuck them all back together again, because they got this funny-looking creature that had a bill like a duck and a beaver-like tail and hair like a bear and webbed feet like an otter and claws like a reptile, laid eggs like a turtle, feeds a shung of milk like a mammal, has spurs like a rooster and poison like a snake. Now, if you found an animal like that, you'd think somebody had stitched all these animals together. But in actual fact, this is a beautifully designed little creature. And you see, the interesting thing is this. If you're going to believe in evolution and believe one kind of animal changed into another, and here you have one that has features of reptiles, birds, and mammals, you have to believe it almost evolved from everything. But the reason it's my favorite creature is because I think every time an evolutionist looks at the platypus, I think God smiles because I think he made it just for them.
The problem is, no intermediate fossils have ever been found. That's right, you heard me correctly. Not a single intermediate fossil has ever been found. Since in theory there would be millions of them, that's a pretty amazing fact. Yes, it appears the missing link is, well, still missing. There's not even a single example of an intermediate fish. Over the years, there have been claims by scientists that such creatures exist. Surely you've seen them in books and magazines and on TV. But when examined, the results have always been the same. The physical evidence, the scientific evidence, shows that the creatures are always nothing more than a member of a complete species, and not a transitional intermediate species at all. And despite the fact that there are drawings of such intermediate creatures in your children's textbooks, amazingly, not a single one is a genuine, tangible example. Not only that, the fossil evidence shows that new species appeared suddenly, abruptly, out of nothing, just like the Bible says in the book of Genesis.
The key problem with Darwinism is finding hard physical evidence. Where would you look for that evidence? Well, obviously in the rocks, in the record of the rocks, the fossil record. Fossils have been collected for hundreds of years, for centuries. There are billions of fossils in every university and every museum in the world. But there are no intermediate species. You look at one strata and you find one kind of fossil. You look at the strata above it and you find a different kind of fossil. What you don't find is a gradual change.
One of the greatest evidences for creation is found in the fossil record. For example, in the so-called Cambrian rocks, we find fossils of a vast array of very complex invertebrates: clams, snails, jellyfish, worms, brachiopods, trilobites, and many other very complex invertebrates. But nowhere on the face of this earth has anyone found fossilized ancestors to a single one of those complex invertebrates. Now that fact alone demolishes the theory of evolution. Every major kind of fish that we know anything about appears fully formed, no trace of ancestors, and certainly no trace of transitional forms linking these major kind of fishes to one another. Now that fact is known. Evolutionists know that.
There's certainly no transitional form out there that proves that life evolved or anything like that. The coelacanth fish for many years was considered transitional between fish and amphibians because it had these bony structures that looked like, well, maybe it's evolving legs, and it had these structures that it was going to walk on the ocean floor and so on. While then, what happened was that they found out that fishermen had been pulling up these fish alive in their nets off the coast of Madagascar for years. Recently they found them in Indonesia in the fish markets as well, and realized these fish are alive and happy swimming around the world today. They're a lobe-fin fish, and the little structures that they thought were evolving legs and so on are actually their lobe fins that enable the fish to be like a helicopter in the water. It's got incredible mobility, and so no longer do they think that the coelacanth is a transitional form.
Evolutionists still insist there are transitional forms, then contradict themselves and say they just haven't been found yet. Dr. Leo Hickey of Yale University.
There's really no problem finding transitional forms.
Then he says just a few minutes later,
Evolution acts in very short bursts. It doesn't leave many transitional forms behind.
Or Preston Cloud, an evolutionist and geologist, who said,
there are so many transitional forms between species that we must often fall back on statistical analysis to separate one from the other.
Then said,
the problem of transitional forms is one that more honest paleontologists have a problem with. The geologic record is incomplete.
Over and over again, it's the Bible that's been shown to be right. Because the Bible tells us that God made distinct kinds of animals and plants to reproduce after their own kind, great variation within a kind. You see that in natural selection, which is not evolution, by the way. It just operates within a kind.
Dr. Colin Patterson of the British Museum of Natural History wrote to aerospace engineer Luther Sunderland, I fully agree with your comments on the lack of direct illustration of evolutionary transitions in my book. If I knew of any, fossil or living, I would certainly have included them. I will lay it on the line. There is not one such fossil for which one might make a watertight argument. It is easy enough to make up stories of how one form gave rise to another, and to find reasons why the stages should be favored by natural selection. But such stories are not part of science, for there is no way to put them to the test. Fossils may tell us many things, but one thing they can never disclose is whether they were ancestors of anything else.
The evolutionists realize that they can no longer rely on the fossil record to give them any support. So what they've done is they've come up with a very crafty alternative to the Darwinian concept of evolution. They call it punctuated equilibrium.
The theory says evolution is stable for long periods of time. Then new species suddenly come into being, and others immediately become extinct.
You see, this solves all kinds of problems intellectually for the evolutionist. He doesn't have to look at the fossil record.
I'm convinced that the idea of punctuated equilibria is really a desperate attempt to salvage evolutionary theory. There is no evidence in the fossil record that one type of animal ever changed into another type of animal. Punctuated equilibria comes along and says that isolated populations of animals evolved rapidly and left no fossil trace. But this is an argument from lack of data. There are no transitional forms, and that's used then as proof of the brand of evolution called punctuated equilibria. This is bad science.
Geneticist Richard Goldschmidt agrees species appeared suddenly, but he still could not admit it was because God created everything. Instead, he came up with the hopeful monster theory, which says a reptile laid an egg and a bird crawled out.
What it does say to us is that the evolutionists are running scared. It seems like almost every new development in science is converging to destroy evolution. And that's true. Regardless of whether we're talking about new discoveries in astronomy or paleontology or biology, this is true. In the last decade, most of the basic pillars upon which evolution has stood have collapsed, and the theory is now in chaos. Unfortunately, at this time, the evolutionists are crying louder than ever before that evolution is a fact.
If evolution was true, we wouldn't be concerned about the extinction of species. There'd be new ones being created. We don't have new species. We got deterioration. We have all kinds of species that no longer exist.
Evolution is not only based on faith, but blind faith at that.
The truth is, there are no examples of evolution in the fossil record, no intermediate transitional species. Out of the millions of fossils found in more than 150 years, the only thing we see are complete species.